What happens when a simple bank visit turns into an intense standoff over identity and power? As tensions rise and secrets unfold, the balance of authority shifts in the most unexpected way. Have you ever been fairly questioned when you knew you were right? Let us know in the comments section below. The sharp click of Serena Graham's heels echoed against the polished marble floors of Union Trust Bank, a fortress of glass and steel that exuded prestige. She walked with quiet confidence, dressed in an elegant navy pantsuit that hugged her frame just right, professional yet commanding. As she approached the counter, she adjusted the designer leather tote on her shoulder, ignoring the brief glance from a suited man stepping aside to let her pass. Her eyes scanned the nameplate in front of the teller, Greg Matthews, mid-40s, with graying brown hair and a crisp but slightly wrinkled dress shirt. He was the kind of man who carried an air of unearned authority, as if the counter between them gave him power beyond just transactions. She had seen his type before, dismissive, smug, the gatekeeper who decided who belonged in spaces like this. Serena placed her checkbook on the counter. "Good morning. I'd like to make a withdrawal." Greg barely looked at her before glancing at the check she had signed, his lips pressed into a thin line. "For this amount, I'll need to see 2 forms of ID." Her brow arched slightly, but she remained composed. "I already have my account card and PIN. That should be enough for verification." He leaned forward, his expression blank but his voice sharp. "I understand, ma'am, but for large transactions we need extra verification." Serena pulled out her driver's license and business card, sliding them across the counter. She could feel the eyes of other customers flicking toward her, subtle, brief, but watching. Greg picked up her ID, examined it for an unnecessary amount of time, then looked at her again. "What's the purpose of this withdrawal?" Serena blinked. "Excuse me?" "It's a substantial amount," Greg continued, still holding her card between his fingers. "Bank policy requires us to document the reason." Serena's jaw tightened. She knew that was a lie. She had made similar withdrawals before, without questions, without resistance. But today was different. Greg's eyes flicked between her and the check, then back to her ID. His expression changed just slightly, a flash of something. Suspicion? Disbelief? Amusement? She could already see where this was going. "I need to step away to verify something," he said, his voice light but dismissive. He turned before she could respond, taking her ID and check with him. Serena inhaled deeply through her nose, holding back the wave of irritation rising in her chest. Why did she always have to prove herself? She had sat in boardrooms with men who didn't think she belonged, had built her company from the ground up in an industry where she was one of the only black women in leadership, and yet, here she was, in a bank, being treated like a fraud. She glanced around. The other tellers worked quickly, handling transactions with ease. No other customer was being asked to verify their identity. Greg returned a minute later, without her check or ID. "We're having trouble verifying your signature," he said. Serena's patience thinned. "I've been banking here for years. My signature is on file." Greg exhaled through his nose, feigning regret. "It's just a precaution. If you'd like, we can place a hold on the transaction while we conduct further verification. I want to speak to your manager." A flicker of something flashed across Greg's face, annoyance, maybe even surprise. He nodded stiffly and disappeared into the back office. Serena's fingers curled into her palm as she waited. She should have expected this. This was more than just banking protocol. This was about power. The seconds stretched into minutes. Then, the manager emerged. A middle-aged woman in a sleek black blazer, her nameplate reading Melissa Carpenter. She walked with quick, purposeful steps, stopping just in front of Serena with a practiced corporate smile. "Miss Graham, I apologize for the delay," Mrs. said smoothly. "We're just trying to make sure everything is in order." "Everything is in order," Serena replied, "and I'd like my check and ID returned immediately." Melissa gave Greg a quick glance before turning back to Serena. "Of course, we just need to confirm the authenticity of your signature." Serena tilted her head, her voice calm but firm. "If there was a problem with my signature, you would have compared it to the one on my account file." The manager hesitated. Serena pressed on. "Instead, you took my ID to the back, so I'm asking again, what exactly are you trying to verify?" Melissa's expression remained neutral, but there was a slight stiffness in her posture now. Greg shifted uncomfortably. He had expected a different reaction, something more submissive, not this direct confrontation. Melissa cleared her throat. "Let me just check with the processing team. One moment." She turned, disappearing behind the frosted glass doors, leaving Greg standing there. Serena didn't break eye contact with him. He looked down. Minutes later, the door opened again, and this time, Melissa wasn't alone. A second man, older, sharply dressed in a tailored navy suit, followed closely behind. His silver-rimmed glasses rested low on his nose, and his expression was unreadable. But as soon as his eyes landed on Serena, something shifted. Recognition. Greg, however, still didn't get it. "This is Mr. Fletcher, our regional director," Melissa introduced. Fletcher approached the counter, taking one glance at the check Greg had been holding hostage. He lifted it, his eyes scanning the signature at the bottom. And then he froze. Serena watched his expression change. Greg still didn't understand, until Fletcher turned, slowly, and spoke. "Greg," his voice was measured, careful, but cold, "do you realize whose signature you've been questioning?" Greg frowned. "I was just following protocol." "That," Fletcher cut him off, tapping the check against the counter, "is the signature on the bank's original charter." Silence. Greg blinked, confusion flickering across his face. Melissa exhaled sharply. "Serena?" She simply waited. Fletcher turned back to her, a small, almost apologetic smile forming. "Ms. Graham, I sincerely apologize for this. Misunderstand." Greg's face drained of color as realization finally hit. Serena gave a slow, measured nod, her presence commanding the entire room now. "You mean the misunderstanding where your employee assumed I wasn't qualified to withdraw from my own bank?" Greg visibly swallowed. Fletcher sighed. "We'll take care of it." Serena tilted her head slightly, watching Greg struggle with the weight of the moment. She didn't have to say a word, because at that moment, he knew exactly who she was. Greg stood there, his fingers gripping the counter, as if he could ground himself in reality, as if somehow the truth wasn't what he had just heard. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. There was no backpedaling from this, no excuse that could smooth over the fact that he had just interrogated the very woman who had authority over the bank itself. Serena remained silent, watching him with the kind of patience that was almost cruel. She had no interest in making him feel comfortable. Fletcher exhaled through his nose and turned to Melissa. "We'll discuss this later," he said, his tone clipped. Melissa gave a small nod, stepping aside, her hands clasped in front of her, like a child waiting to be scolded. Serena held out her hand. "I'd like my ID and my check." Rake's fingers twitched, but he handed them over quickly. Serena took them with a slow, deliberate movement, then examined the check, making a point to tilt it just enough to ensure it was intact. The moment stretched unbearably for Greg, who clearly wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Serena tucked her ID back into her wallet and smoothed her sleeve. Then finally she spoke. "Do you know how exhausting this is?" Greg swallowed hard. I was just following protocol." Serena tilted her head slightly, as if she had expected that response. "Tell me, Greg, in all your years working here, how many times have you asked someone for a second form of ID after they entered their account PIN?" His lips pressed together, but no words came out. Fletcher's gaze flickered to Greg, his disapproval clear. Melissa cleared her throat. "Ms. Graham, we sincerely apologize for any—" Serena held up a hand, and Melissa fell silent instantly. "I didn't ask for an apology. Serena said, her voice steady. "I asked a question." Greg's face reddened. It's just that with certain amounts, How many?" Serena pressed. Greg looked to Melissa for help, but she only inhaled sharply through her nose and kept her eyes down. Serena already knew the answer. "Do you know how many transactions I've made at this bank?" she continued. "Because I do. Over the last 6 years, I've deposited millions into accounts here, and yet, somehow, this is the first time my identity has ever been in question." Greg's jaw clenched, but there was nothing he could say. "I don't care about your excuses," Serena continued, her voice even but unmistakably sharp. "I care about the fact that when you saw me, your first instinct was to assume I didn't belong." Greg winced. He opened his mouth again, but before he could speak, Serena took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough to make sure every word hits its mark. "And you know what's funny?" she said. "You're standing in a bank that only exists because of my family's money." Greg visibly flinched. The weight of what he had just done fully settled into his bones. Serena took a deep breath and stepped back, straightening her shoulders. Then she turned to Fletcher. "I need a private meeting room." Fletcher nodded immediately. "Of course. Right this way, Miss Graham." Greg exhaled shakily as Serena followed Fletcher through the bank. No one spoke. The other tellers had gone completely silent, avoiding eye contact. Customers, some pretending not to be eavesdropping, had frozen in place. Greg could feel their eyes on him. The heat crawled up his neck, humiliating and inescapable. Serena was led through a glass-paneled hallway, passing by a row of executive offices before stopping in front of a conference room. Fletcher opened the door for her, motioning for her to step inside. Once they were in, he let out a breath. "Miss Graham, Serena held up a hand again. "I need account documents," she said plainly. "All of them." Fletcher nodded. "I'll have them brought in." Serena folded her arms. "And Greg?" Fletcher hesitated. "He will be dealt with." She arched a brow. "Suspended?" she asked. Fletcher shifted slightly. "I?" Serena let out a small, humorless laugh. "You weren't hesitating when you called me Ms. Graham just now." Fletcher stiffened. Serena continued, her voice calm but unmovable. "If he still has a job by the end of the day, I'll pull my accounts." Fletcher's eyes widened slightly. Serena didn't flinch. 6 years, millions deposited, and today I was treated like an imposter in a bank that literally has my family's name in its records. Fletcher ran a hand down his tie. "I understand." "Good," Serena said, "because this is bigger than Greg. This is about the culture you've allowed to exist here." Fletcher straightened. Serena smoothed her sleeve again. "Send the documents to my attorney," she added. "We'll be reviewing everything." Fletcher nodded quickly. "Absolutely, Miss Graham." Serena turned, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she exited the conference room. As she walked through the bank, every pair of eyes seemed to track her movements. Customers, tellers, even security. She didn't acknowledge them. She stopped briefly in front of Greg's counter. He was still standing there, still pale. She didn't say a word. She just looked at him. And then, with a small, knowing smirk, she tucked her check into her purse and walked away. Greg stood frozen, his face burning with humiliation. And he knew, without question, that his days at Union Trust were numbered. Greg stood behind the counter, his face still frozen in that same stunned expression, but inside he was unraveling. The murmurs around the bank had grown into full conversations. He could hear the hushed voices of other customers, the quiet, knowing glances from fellow tellers, and the absolute silence from Melissa, who hadn't looked at him once since Serena had left the conference room. His mind raced. He had made a mistake. A big one. But he didn't just make a mistake. He had underestimated the wrong person. Greg had spent years behind this counter, years judging people based on instinct, on their clothes, their demeanor, their accents, their perceived wealth. He'd convinced himself it wasn't personal, that it was just due diligence, that he was simply doing his job. But now, with the weight of his actions crashing down on him, he felt something he hadn't expected. Shame. Fletcher's office door swung open and Greg flinched as the regional director stepped out, his jaw set, his expression unreadable. Fletcher's eyes met his for only a second before he turned to Melissa. Office, now. Melissa's head snapped up, her eyes flicking between Greg and Fletcher, before she nodded quickly and followed him inside. Greg swallowed hard. A part of him hoped that meant he wasn't the only one in trouble. A bigger part of him knew it didn't matter. Minutes stretched into eternity before Melissa reappeared. She didn't look at him. She didn't say anything. She just walked back to her station, her face blank, her movements stiff. Then Fletcher stepped out, this time looking directly at Greg. My office. Greg's throat felt tight, but he forced himself to move. The stares followed him as he stepped from behind the counter, his legs heavier than they'd ever been. Inside the office, Fletcher shut the door behind him. The air was thick with an unspoken finality. Greg took a slow breath, sitting across from Fletcher's desk, his palms already sweating. Fletcher didn't sit. Instead, he placed both hands flat on his desk, leaning forward slightly. You do realize what you've done, don't you? Greg nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. Fletcher stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. She owns part of this bank, Fletcher said, his voice carefully measured. Her family's money helped establish the foundation of this institution. She has direct influence over accounts that far exceed the salary you make in a year. And yet, he exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw, you treated her like a criminal. Greg opened his mouth, but Fletcher held up a hand. I don't want to hear excuses. I don't want to hear about protocol or standard verification. We both know what this was. Greg looked down. He did know. You didn't question her credentials, Fletcher continued, his voice sharp. You questioned her. You saw a black woman withdrawing a large amount, and you made an assumption. And because of that assumption, we are now dealing with a potential lawsuit, an internal investigation, and the very real possibility that she will pull her accounts from this bank entirely. Greg's stomach dropped. She wants you gone. Fletcher said it plainly, without emotion. And honestly, she's not wrong. Greg's hands clenched into fists. Fired, just like that, years of work gone. He thought about his mortgage, his bills, his savings that were nowhere near what they should be. Please, sir, he started, his voice cracking slightly. Fletcher shook his head. Your last paycheck will be processed by the end of the week. Greg's entire body went cold. This isn't just about Serena Graham, Fletcher said, watching him carefully. This is about the way you treat customers. How many others have walked in here, deposited their hard-earned money, only to be met with suspicion and hostility from you? Greg's mind flashed back to moments he had ignored. The black man in construction boots who he had given a hard time when he wanted to cash his paycheck. The Latina woman with the thick accent who he had asked for an extra ID even though she had banked there for years. The elderly black couple who had come in together to discuss a loan, and he had barely concealed his skepticism about whether they'd be approved. How many people had he turned away without realizing it? How many had simply accepted the humiliation and moved on? Fletcher's voice cut through his thoughts. Pack your things. Greg's breath was shallow, his face pale. He had seen people fired before. He had smirked when others got walked out. But now it was him, and it felt different. He stood up slowly, his movements mechanical, and walked out of Fletcher's office. The bank was dead silent. His co-workers, who had worked beside him for years, wouldn't meet his eyes. He grabbed his personal belongings from behind the counter. It wasn't much. A coffee mug, a few pens, a framed photo of his ex-wife and daughter, from a time before his life had started falling apart. As he turned toward the exit, he saw her. Serena Graham stood near the entrance, talking to a man in a tailored suit, probably her lawyer. She didn't even need to acknowledge him. Her presence alone made it clear that this was over for him. But still, she looked up. Their eyes met for a brief second. And Greg, for the first time in his life, felt completely and utterly powerless. He pushed open the doors and stepped out into the cold afternoon air, his future uncertain. But one thing was for sure. This would be the moment he would remember for the rest of his life. Serena watched Greg push through the heavy glass doors of the bank, his shoulders hunched, his entire posture weighed down by the consequences of his actions. She didn't need to see his face to know what was running through his mind. Humiliation, regret, fear. For once, the burden wasn't on her. She let out a slow breath, then turned back to the suited man beside her. Malcolm Lawson, her attorney. "Is lucky," she said quietly. Malcolm arched a brow. "Lucky." Serena nodded, watching Greg's retreating figure through the glass. "Because this could have gone much worse for him. If I were someone else, if I didn't have the resources I do, this would have ended in police involvement. Maybe worse." Malcolm sighed. "You're right. And that's the real problem, isn't it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned, her gaze sweeping over the bank. The customers had returned to their transactions, but there was a shift in the air, an unspoken tension, a newfound awareness. She walked toward the counter, stopping directly in front of Melissa, who had been visibly avoiding her since the confrontation. Serena rested her hands on the counter. "Do you know why I didn't ask for you to be fired?" Melissa's throat bobbed as she swallowed. I don't know." Serena let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. "You didn't intervene," she finally said. "You saw what was happening and you didn't stop it, but you also didn't escalate it." Melissa's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. "I don't reward inaction," Serena continued, her voice even. "But I also recognize the difference between compliance and complicity. You're the branch manager, which means you set the tone for how this place operates. Moving forward, what happens under your watch will reflect on you." Melissa nodded quickly, her hands clasped in front of her. "Understood." Serena studied her for a moment longer, then turned to Fletcher, who had remained silent but attentive. "I want a meeting with the board." Fletcher gave a single nod. "I'll arrange it." She stepped back, adjusting her tote bag on her shoulder. "Good. Because I'm not just here to make a point. I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen again." She turned and walked toward the doors, Malcolm following beside her. Once outside, the cool air hit her skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the confrontation inside. Malcolm exhaled sharply. "Well, that was one way to handle things." Serena smirked. "You expected something different?" He chuckled. "No, but I have to say, you have a talent for making a man regret his life choices without raising your voice once." She hummed in amusement, but her mind was already elsewhere. "I want to reevaluate where I'm keeping my money," she said, her voice thoughtful. "I've been loyal to this bank because of history, but history doesn't excuse incompetence." Malcolm nodded. "Understood. I'll pull reports on alternative options." She knew what he was thinking, that she'd won, that this was over. But Serena knew better, because winning wasn't just about today. It was about making sure there wasn't another Serena Graham who had to stand in a bank one day and fight for the right to access her own money. She was done being questioned, and if they thought this was the end, they had another thing coming. This was only the beginning.